All right, guys, this is APUSH notes starting on, this is Wednesday the 18th. And what we're going to do today is we're going to cover kind of the beginnings of the Cold War, what the Cold War is and how it starts or when it starts. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the beginnings of kind of the Truman presidency, talk a little bit about the Second Red Scare. So those are kind of our two big topics. So yesterday we sort of established, or in the last video, we sort of established what was going on with the United States in the aftermath of World War II, the creation of the United Nations, the creation of other institutions like that. And we left off on this slide looking at the way that Europe is sort of becoming divided between communist East, right, and then kind of non-communist West. And so what we're up to today is sort of talking about like how that happens, right? Where does this divide come from, and what does it take for us to call this a Cold War? So first up, if it's 1945, right, the war is just ending, what is sort of already present as far as reasons why there's tension that's going to grow into the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union? So the three things on the slide here. The number one thing is a long ongoing divide between the U.S. and the Soviet Union over our sort of political and economic ideologies. So the United States is a capitalist country with our sort of version of democracy, and we think that both of those are awesome and that that's the way that all other countries should run themselves. Soviet Union, on the other hand, has their version of communism, sort of Stalinistic communism, and they think that that's awesome and that that's the way that every other country should run themselves as well. And so where the Cold War becomes is this kind of competition for which of these systems will dominate the globe, like which system will kind of win out. I always feel like that sounds kind of supervillain-esque, but that is basically what the Cold War is about. Like if I was like, tell me in one sentence what the Cold War is about, that bullet point on number one there, that's what the answer I would give. It's a competition for which of the two kind of economic / political systems are going to dominate the globe. So that's already a source of tension. It has been for a while, but it's definitely a source of tension between the two countries in 1945. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, is also concerned by the fact that the United States has atomic weapons. We have just demonstrated that by deploying 2 in Japan, while the Soviet Union does not have atomic weapons yet. In fact, they officially didn't even know that we were building them, even though we were supposed to be allies. And so the Soviet Union is going to almost immediately try to kind of catch up and surpass the United States by attempting to design and build their own atomic weapons. And we'll talk about when they succeed, and that'll come a few slides down in the notes themselves. So that's something like the Soviet Union, what they're kind of mad at the United States about at the end of the war. This is one of the things. The U.S., on the other hand, is much more concerned about number 3 down here, the growing tendency that we see for Europe to be kind of divided between communist-controlled Eastern Europe and then non-communist controlled Western Europe. We basically see that the Soviet Union has kind of taken over a bunch of territory, both at the beginning of the war and then kind of throughout World War II, and they're kind of not giving it back, right? They're still maintaining political control or political sway over all of these countries in Eastern Europe. We want them to give what we would consider to be free elections, and we don't think that they're doing that. So those are kind of already in place issues as of 1945. By 1946, it's become pretty apparent to anybody who's paying attention that Europe very much is divided into 2 halves. And we can tell this, or the person who kind of gives name to this trend is Winston Churchill. Churchill is the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he is doing what a lot of former politicians do. He's going on a speaking tour around the world. And so he's in the United States at a college in Fulton, Missouri, when he gives a speech that comes to be known as the Iron Curtain speech, where he says an iron curtain has descended, and you can kind of see that in the red line that's appearing on the slide there, basically dividing symbolically the communist-controlled eastern part of Europe, which is now, he's going to refer to as being behind the Iron Curtain, and then non-communist Western Europe. Very important, going to sound dumb, but very important, the Iron Curtain is not an actual curtain. Repeat, the Iron Curtain is not an actual curtain. We're going to get to the Berlin Wall, which is an actual physical wall, right? But this is not a physical divide. It's a metaphor for the division that sprung up again between communist and non-communist Europe on an east-west axis. The Iron Curtain is a pretty important phrase that you definitely need to understand. If you're kind of having a hard time with the curtain part of it, don't think like kitchen curtains. Think more like a stage curtain that would just sort of drop really suddenly and kind of dramatically, right, to signal the end of a scene or something of that nature. That's the kind of curtain that Churchill means here. So by 1946, it's become pretty apparent to anybody who's paying attention that there is this divide, but does that equate to a Cold War, right, is the basic question. Well, by 1946, we can definitely see U.S. policy start to change in response to the situation. If you're looking at U.S. foreign policy post-World War II, it's obviously President Truman is like the chief policymaker, but the person that has really a lot of influence is the Secretary of State, George Marshall, the head of the State Department. And then Marshall pays a lot of attention to a U.S. diplomat who is sort of a long-term, I would say kind of like policy expert on the Soviet Union. He's lived in the Soviet Union for many years as part of the U.S. Embassy there. And his name is George Kennan. In 46 and then again in 47, he writes, it's a very long telegram that's called the Long Telegram because we're super creative that way. And it's this whole like screed where he's basically like, wake up, America, right? Like if the U.S. government needs to know, says Kennan in the Long Telegram, that the Soviet Union already sees this as a war, right? They already see themselves as at war with capitalism. And if we don't like aggressively do something about it, then they're going to have a leg up on us, right? They're already aggressively pursuing the expansion of communism. And so we need to pursue what he refers to as containment. Containment is the most significant word for this entire unit. Like it's just going to come up a ton. Absolutely need to understand what it means. It is the U.S. foreign policy of trying to stop communism from spreading. So again, U.S. foreign policy position that basically says we're not going to attack communism where it already is. We don't want to start World War III, right? That seems like a bad idea. But we do want to stop communism from spreading into new territories, stop the Soviet Union from gaining new territories, etc. From 1946-47, when the U.S. adopts containment policy, until 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolves and the Cold War ends. So 1946 to 1991, that whole time period, containment is the basis of every single U.S. foreign policy action. These are the stuff going on too, but for the most part, if you're like, why did we fight that war? Or why were we in this country? Or why did we decide to do that? The answer at its heart is containment. It's about containment of communism. So it's really, really, really important for you to both to just understand what containment means and then also to be able to kind of situate it time-wise. So if you're looking at U.S. foreign policy post-World War II, but prior to like 1990, it's going to be about containment in some way. We're going to have 9 presidents in that time, and they're all going to kind of handle containment differently. So it'll look a little differently under like Truman or Kennedy or Ronald Reagan, right? But it is containing communism at its heart. First thing that the U.S. does that we could consider containment is issuing the Truman Doctrine. Anytime we have a presidential doctrine, it's a statement of foreign policy. And the Truman Doctrine specifically says if your country is in danger of essentially getting taken over by communism, we will give you weapons, money to help resist. We were really concerned about Turkey and Greece at the time, where there were nascent or sort of baby communist uprisings going on. If you look at this little inset map, you can see here's like the Soviet Union in brown, and then there's Turkey and Greece right down there. You can see why they would be kind of like, I guess, geographically vulnerable to kind of a communist incursion. And so that was what we were particularly concerned about in March of 1947. But it is the first time that you see an official, like, not just internal within the U.S. government, like the Long Telegram was, but an official statement of U.S. foreign policy that's kind of containment-based. So that's the Truman Doctrine. Within a few months of this, the U.S. is going to finalize what we've been working on for a little while at this point, and that is our first defensive alliance, or our first permanent peacetime military alliance. U.S. foreign policy up to this point has had us, we've never been involved in any alliance except at war. So we've fought in alliances like during World War I, but we've always exited them immediately after. We've never like stayed in an alliance with another country when we weren't at war. NATO is that first time that we've done that. We're still in it today. It stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the United States is a founder kind of leader of NATO. It's what's called a defensive alliance, containing all of the countries that are in green up here. This is a modern day map of NATO, not the original one. So for example, like here's Italy. The defensive alliance part means that like if Italy just suddenly goes nuts and decides to whatever attack the Soviet Union, then NATO doesn't oblige us to fight with them. But if the Soviet Union attacks Italy, and then we are obliged to help them defend themselves. So it's just a defensive alliance. And the idea behind it is what we call collective security. The idea that if, maybe the Soviet Union will be less likely to attack Italy if they know that in doing so, they're going to get the entirety of NATO coming at them, right? Like, so strength in numbers type thing. So that's NATO. Again, like if you're thinking continuity and change over time, this is a major change in U.S. foreign policy, a complete and up to this point permanent shift in how we handle our foreign policy. Right around the same time that NATO is happening, the United States is also going to announce and pass something called the Marshall Plan. This is named after Secretary of State George Marshall. And what it was an opportunity for foreign aid money to any country that needed it to like physically recover from World War II. So if you are like West Germany or Great Britain or Italy and you have like bombing damage or physical damage and you want to rebuild, the US will loan you money to do that. And this may on the surface of it not seem like it has much to do with containment, but it does actually because um, Marshall reckons correctly, I think, that communism is like more attractive when things are bad. Like if you're living a nice middle class life, then maybe communism doesn't seem so great. But if you're like poor and you're living in a bombed out building, then it seems like a better idea. So the Marshall Plan is this plan to rebuild Europe, both because like that seems like a good idea, and also because we think it'll make Western Europe less vulnerable to communist takeover. We're really like in this period, we're concerned about like France, right? Turning into a communist country or something like that. So that's the point of the Marshall Plan. Very, very, very common for people to get the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, confused. So they're both kind of about containment, but the Truman Doctrine is about like military containment, and the Marshall Plan is more economic. It's just good to keep those apart. The Soviet Union's not just sitting around during all this. They're forming their own alliance, a defensive alliance similar to NATO. It's called Warsaw Pact. You mostly just need to know that this is the Soviet Union's alliance. There's not like a ton specific about this. If you look at the map down here, all of the countries in blue are NATO. The dark blue is original NATO, and then the lighter blue are countries that have joined. Like you can see kind of the dates down here. And then all of the red, that's the Warsaw Pact. So you can see like it doesn't look like as many countries, but boy, it sure does cover a lot of landmass, right? So you can see that in that kind of stretched out map down there. So we're kind of summing up like what the Cold War is and then how it's fought. The Cold War is an ideological struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States. And the reason that we call it a Cold War is because it's a war, right? But it's never going to be directly fought between those two countries. The United States and the Soviet Union are never going to directly like fire at each other, like aiming shots or anything like that on any official level throughout the entire 1945 to 1991 period of the Cold War. If you're like, well, how's that a war? If you can think about it sort of like the way you can use the word fight to mean like if you're in a fight with someone, you could literally be in a fight with them like you have punched them, right? Traditional war. Or you can be like in a fight in the sense that you're not talking to your friend and you're, talking smack about each other on social media, or you're trying to get your whole friend group to sit with you at lunch instead of them, right? That kind of fight, that second kind of fight, that's what the Cold War is more. It's like a struggle or a conflict over ideology. And so we're going to fight it through some methodologies that might not look very traditional. Number one, through a competition for intelligence, spying, espionage. The U.S. is going to set up the CIA. The Soviet Union has a whole variety of different intelligence agencies. The KGB is maybe the only one you need to know about. We're going to have competitive races, arms races, space race, who has the best technology, kind of. We have our competing alliances. And we also have this kind of general like ideological competition for people outside of the initial Cold War sphere. So I have third world peoples, which is kind of loaded terminology up here, but sort of think more like Latin America, so South and Central America. Think about Asia, especially Southeast Asia, and then the Middle East to some extent. That's really where a lot of this is going to be played out as we try to convince people in, say, Afghanistan, for example, to be communist or to be democratic. What this means is that the US and the Soviet Union are both going to engage themselves in a lot of what we might call proxy war. Proxy war is when there's already a conflict going on, like a civil war, say, for example, and then another country kind of parachutes in on top of it and makes that conflict about their other bigger conflict. If you look at, for the United States, both Korea and the Vietnam War are essentially proxy wars as part of the Cold War. So they're sort of part of the broader Cold War struggle, even though there's kind of initial conflicts going on that aren't really necessarily directly about communism. That's kind of the Cold War in summary. This is a great summary slide to come back to if you're kind of trying to just get your head around like what is the Cold War. When does the Cold War start? Well, you could point to, you could say 1945 when the war ends. You could point to Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. You could say the Truman Doctrine, right? Those are all like valid places to start the Cold War. But if you are still holding out and you're still like, doesn't seem like a war to me, the last possible start date that you could use for the Cold War is the Berlin airlift. The situation in Berlin, if you remember from yesterday's notes, is pretty wackadoo. It's very odd. We have Berlin, the city, surrounded by East Germany, but divided in half. East Berlin, communist, part of East Germany. West Berlin, not communist, and part of West Germany, which is weird geographically, right? So Stalin has looked at the situation and has also been like, this is weird, and basically decides to blockade West Berlin to try to keep it from, or to try to force it to fall to communism, basically. He wants it to sort of surrender. He's going to blockade the whole half a city, keep allies from coming in or out. The allies could, we could just let West Berlin fall. It's like half a city, right? We don't want to do that. Containment. We could drop bombs on the blockade. We could fly over it and we could start World War III, which we don't really want to do that either. So we're going to decide to take kind of a middle road. We're going to decide to do what we call the Berlin airlift. The Berlin airlift, we didn't know it at the time, but it's going to last for an entire year, June to May of 48 or 49. And what this involves is Allied air crews, United States, British, Canadian, etc., taking off from West Germany, taking off from West Germany and then flying out over East Germany, where they're not shut down because the Soviets don't want to start a war either, and then flying over the city of West Berlin and dropping off all of the supplies that are necessary to keep that city sort of functional for it is going to turn out to be a year. Food, medicine, toilet paper, clothing, right? All of that kind of stuff has to be supplied by air. The Berlin airlift is considered both the first conflict of the Cold War and is also considered an American or a not Soviet victory because the Soviets are going to give up the blockade in May of 1949. They're going to be forced to essentially to stop blockading. They're going to sort of turn their attention to other things. If you're thinking like little scoreboard, this is like US 1, Soviet Union 0. But we don't want to get too cocky because the Soviet Union is going to answer this pretty quickly by detonating their first atomic bomb. In August of 1949, the Soviet Union is going to successfully explode their first atomic weapon. This is a big deal. They've caught up to us. We no longer have the lead in the atomic race, so we're sort of 1-to-1, right, if you're kind of keeping track. And then also that same year, another major loss for the United States comes with the Communist Revolution, or in China, Chinese Revolution. The Chinese Revolution is very complex and somewhat outside the scope of our class as a U.S. history class, but very briefly, remember that China has had conflict of some sort or another for a long time. The Japanese invaded Manchuria in 1931. They hit the city of Nanjing, Beijing, in 1937. And so by this point, if we're talking about 1949, there's been some sort of war going on for about 10 years. And what that's done is it's really produced a fairly effective kind of civil war inside of China between the Communist Party, headed by this guy here, Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, which are really, I would say, entrenched and strong up in the northern part of China, Manchuria. They had been kind of the chief resistance to the Japanese occupation of that region. And then the U.S. backed the government of China, what we usually call the nationalist government of China. It's headed by a party called the Kuomintang, which I'm sure I'm not quite pronouncing correctly, but that's basically the name of the party, and headed by Chiang Kai-shek. So starting in, there's a lot more to this, but basically early in 1949, the Communist Party, which has grown a lot in strength up here in this kind of darker purple region, is going to surge down, and after a series of battles, they're going to basically take the capital city of Beijing. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists are still fleeing. They're going to set up a temporary government down here for a little while, and then they're eventually going to wind up taking, it's 2.5 million nationalists, people who are not communist and don't want to be communist. They're going to flee to the island of Taiwan, right down here. Taipei is the island, but the entity of Taiwan, and they're going to set up a sort of a government in exile there on Taiwan. They're going to be like, we are the government of China. We may have been chased out of our palaces, right, but we are still the government of China. Meanwhile, Mao and the Communist Party set up government in Beijing, and they're like, this is China, right? This is mainland China. So no, we are the government of China. And so we wind up with a situation that essentially still exists today, where you have two governments basically both claiming to be the Chinese government. You have the People's Republic of China over here. That's the communist government that controls mainland China. And then you have what's correctly known as the Republic of Taiwan, the Republic of China, but what we call Taiwan. And that is this flag right here. And that's the national, sort of US-backed China that's on the island of Taiwan. From 1949 until the 1970s, the US is going to officially recognize this government on Taiwan as China. They're going to hold the seat on the UN. It's a whole thing. So it's not until the 1970s that we're going to start to really open diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. The fall of China to communism is a big blow from the U.S. perspective for Truman and for the Democrats. We spent a year keeping half a city supplied so it wouldn't fall to communism. So if we sort of have missed or flubbed the largest country in the world by population falling to communism, that's that's a problem. That doesn't look very good, I think, for a lot of people. In response to the Communist Revolution and also to the Korean War, which is kind of about to start at this time, the U.S. government is going to issue what's called NSC 68. NSC stands for National Security Council Document 68. And what this does is I would say, kind of reframes the Cold War in much more, I have the word militant on the slide here, but much more sort of strict or stern terms. And specifically what it does is it calls for a huge uptick in peacetime military spending. Remember, the traditional pattern for the United States has been that we come into war pretty unprepared, and then we build up our military big time during the war, and then we kind of shrink it back down after the war. We've talked, every single war we've had so far, we've talked about it in that pattern. And you can kind of still see this is the defense, U.S. defense budget over here. And so you can see here, we're not really spending much, and then we join, World War II, and then it sort of spikes up, and we're fighting the war, we're spending a lot of money. And then after the war, it goes back down, right? That's the very typical pattern for the U.S. up to this point. But what NSC 68 does here, right here in 1950, basically, is it's going to almost re-spike our defense spending, and it's going to create a permanent high level of defense and military spending that we maintain today. So the kind of army military that the United States has today, where we have this big sort of peacetime military, it doesn't matter if we're at war or not. We always have, a lot of people who are in the military. We're producing a tremendous amount of tanks and weapons and planes and all that kind of stuff. That starts with NSC 68 as part of the Cold War. This is when military spending becomes a big part of our budget and a big part of our economy, et cetera. So it's kind of an important turning point in a couple different ways there. Right. So NSC 68 is a pretty good lead in to talking very briefly about some of the stuff that's going on in the Truman administration. You can kind of consider this like Cold War at home, domestic impacts of the Cold War is maybe a decent way to think about this. And so one of the first things that Truman does is rearrange the government's kind of military organization a bit. This is not super important. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but it's worth noting that this is when the CIA is officially created. All of our espionage prior had been done by the military, but this is when we create a separate government agency. This is also when the Truman administration is going to start to concern itself with the theory that there are secret communists hiding inside the United States. The second Red Scare, like the first Red Scare that we had after World War I, is about this fear that somehow that communism might overthrow American government or American society. If you remember, the first Red Scare after World War I was really concerned with immigrants, right? It was this whole idea of immigrants are bringing dangerous, radical ideas. The second Red Scare that we're in here after World War II, the second Red Scare is more about the idea of communist spies, that there's secret spies, they're embedded in our lives, in our government, in our institution. And so Truman starts a series of, they're usually called loyalty programs, where he investigates people inside the U.S. government to see if they have past ties to communist organizations or labor unions, things of that nature. We also start to really heat up investigation of Soviet spies. There's two very high profile cases of people arrested for passing military secrets to the Soviets. A guy named Alger Hiss, who was a State Department official in 1948, and then a married couple, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Julius Rosenberg worked for the Manhattan Project, producing the atomic bomb, and the government convicts him of passing nuclear secrets to the Soviets. And so those two really high profile trials, I think, convince a lot of Americans that this is really a problem. There really are a lot of spies out there, and they're a serious threat. And this is kind of where the Red Scare really scales up. If you're looking for examples of the Red Scare, the United States Congress is going to initiate in both the House and the Senate sets of hearings where they investigate the truth of communists in everyday life. So if you know anything, if you remember kind of the powers of Congress, one of the things that Congress can do is if they think there's a problem, they can investigate it. They can set up investigations. And so the House of Representatives, revives a committee called HUAC. Stands for the House Un-American Activities Committee, but we usually just say HUAC. And they're actually gonna investigate pretty broadly, but they specifically wind up focusing on investigations of the Hollywood film industry. If you get a chance and you want to check them out, this link down here, this is a maybe 3 or 4 minute clip of HUAC investigations, so you can kind of get a sense of how it goes. It's important to keep in mind that the Congress can't arrest people, right? Nobody's going to jail here for being a communist, but it does smear and ruin a lot of people's reputations and their careers, etc. So HUAC is kind of the House branch. The Senate branch is headed by a guy named Joseph McCarthy. He's a senator from Wisconsin who I think basically sees this as an opportunity to gain some power. In 1950, he's giving a speech. He claims that he has a list of people who are in the State Department who are this acronym right here, CPUSA, that stands for the Communist Party of the U.S. So a list of known communists who are working in our State Department. That's not really true, but he's going to ride that claim into a series of Senate hearings that he kind of headlines or capitalizes on. If you happen to have read The Crucible, the play The Crucible about the Salem witchcraft trials for English at any point, the guy who wrote The Crucible, Arthur Miller, was basically writing about this. The Crucible premiered in, I think it was 1956 when the play opened, and Miller had been hauled up in front of Congress to be investigated about his past ties to communism, and so he wrote the Crucible about how these people in this village, they're looking for witches, but there really aren't any witches. It's just fear and paranoia and hysteria. He wrote that as like a long metaphor for McCarthyism, this idea that we're sort of looking for these secret communists, they really don't exist. That's kind of the argument of the play itself. So this part of the Second Red Scare, we'll kind of circle back to McCarthyism because it sort of extends out into the 1952 election, which is going to be kind of a topic for next week. The last kind of part of the Red Scare, in the last slide for today, is an act that's passed called the Taft-Hartley Act. This has to do with labor unions. And what it does is it takes a lot of the powers that unions were given under FDR, or the Wagner Act that was part of the Second New Deal, and it's going to roll them back, specifically because of fear that labor unions are really communist. Remember, we've had this is kind of a traditional concern of a lot of people in the United States about labor unions, that they're sort of secret communist organizations, etc. And so the Taft-Hartley Act kind of represents both an increasingly conservative 1950s that's, it's not anti-labor, but it's not like real pro-labor either. And then also it's also kind of considered part of the Red Scare itself. So when we pick back up with the next note set, we will talk a little bit more about kind of the domestic 1950s. We'll talk about suburbs and the baby boom, and a little bit about Truman's policies, probably concluding with the Korean War. So feel free to email me any questions, and have a wonderful day. Thanks, guys.